Once upon a time, in the land of Israel, there was a Levite. The Levites were chosen by God to serve in the temple and perform religious duties. This particular Levite lived in the hill country of Ephraim, a peaceful region. He had a concubine, a woman from Bethlehem in Judah. She was not his wife, but she lived with him as his companion. Over time, their relationship began to sour. The concubine became unhappy with the Levite for reasons that were not fully clear. After an argument, she left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem. The Levite was deeply troubled by her departure. He missed her greatly and could not bear the loneliness. After several months of separation, the Levite made the decision to go to Bethlehem and bring her back. He packed his belongings and set out with his servant on a long journey to find her. The journey was long and tiring, but the Levite was determined. After several days of travel, he finally arrived in Bethlehem. When he arrived at the concubine's father's house, he was greeted by the father with open arms. The Levite explained that he wanted to bring his concubine back, that he had regretted their argument and was ready to make things right. The father, though cautious, welcomed the Levite in and invited him to stay. The Levite stayed with the father for several days. The days passed slowly as the Levite tried to convince the concubine to return with him. She was still upset and unsure about going back, but after much persuasion, she finally agreed. The father, seeing the reconciliation, was pleased, but he was not ready to let his daughter go. He asked the Levite to stay another day, which the Levite reluctantly agreed to. Each day, the father invited him to stay a little longer, and eventually the Levite agreed to stay for several more days, enjoying the comfort of the home and the kindness of his father-in-law. Finally, the Levite could not delay any longer. He told the father that it was time to go. The father tried once more to keep them another night, but this time the Levite insisted that they leave. He thanked the father for his hospitality, and along with the concubine and his servant, set out for their home. The journey back was just as long and difficult as the journey there. The Levite, the concubine, and the servant made their way home, but as the sun began to set, they reached the city of Jebus, a town inhabited by the Jebusites. It was getting late, and the Levite considered staying there for the night. But he was wary. Jebus was not an Israelite city, and he feared that the Jebusites might not treat them kindly. Deciding against it, they traveled on. As the evening darkened further, they reached the town of Gibeah, a city in the tribe of Benjamin. The Levite hoped that they would find shelter there, as it was an Israelite city, and surely someone would show them hospitality. They entered the town square and waited, hoping someone would offer them a place to stay. But as the hours passed, no one came forward. The town square was full of busy people, but none offered their help. The Levite began to grow uneasy. It was getting colder, and the night was growing darker. They had no place to stay, and the situation felt increasingly dangerous. At that moment, an old man, who was also from the hill country of Ephraim, walked into the town square. When he saw the Levite and his group standing there, he approached them and asked where they were headed. The Levite explained their situation, and the old man immediately offered them a place to stay in his home. The Levite, his concubine, and his servant gratefully accepted. The old man welcomed them warmly into his home. He provided them with food and water to wash their feet. The Levite and his group felt relieved and safe for the night. They enjoyed a meal together, and the old man told them stories about his life and the history of the land. They spent the evening laughing and talking, grateful for the shelter. But as the night grew darker, the peaceful evening was shattered. There was a loud knock at the door. A mob of wicked men from the town of Gibeah had gathered outside. They surrounded the house and demanded that the Levite be handed over to them. The men of Gibeah were notorious for their violence, and they wanted to harm the Levite. The old man was horrified by their demand. He begged them not to do such a wicked thing. He tried to reason with them, asking them to leave the Levite alone. But the men would not listen. They grew louder and more aggressive, demanding that the Levite come out of the house. The old man was terrified. He didn't know what to do. In a moment of fear and panic, he offered the mob his own daughter and the Levite's concubine, asking them to take the women instead of the Levite. He begged them not to harm the Levite, but the mob rejected his offer. They refused the women and insisted on taking the Levite. In that terrible moment, the Levite made a decision that would haunt him forever. In his desperation to protect himself, he pushed his concubine out the door to the mob. She cried out in horror, but the Levite stayed inside, locking the door behind her. The mob dragged her into the street. They abused her throughout the night, and when morning came, they left her broken and battered, lying lifeless in the street. When the Levite opened the door the next morning, he found his concubine lying in the street. She was covered in bruises and cuts. She could barely move, and she was struggling to breathe. He called her name, but she did not respond. In his shock and guilt, the Levite did not immediately rush to help her. Instead, he coldly told her to get up, but she could not. She had been hurt so badly that she could not stand. The Levite did not help her. He simply took her lifeless body and carried it back home, not seeking help, not showing any sign of mercy. When they arrived at his house, the Levite did something horrifying. In his grief and anger, he took a knife and cut his concubine's body into 12 pieces. He sent one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. When the Israelites received the pieces of her body, they were filled with horror and rage. They could not believe what had happened. He sent the pieces as a call to action. He wanted them to see the evil crime and demand justice. The tribes of Israel were shocked by the brutality of the crime and the Levites' actions. They gathered together in one place and decided to seek justice. The Levites' extreme act of sending the body parts sparked outrage. The tribes of Israel demanded that the men of Gibeah be punished for their crime. The conflict led to a devastating civil war. The tribe of Benjamin, which included the men of Gibeah, refused to give up the criminals. The war between the tribes of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin became bloody and fierce. The Israelites fought the Benjamites, determined to punish the wicked men of Gibeah. The battle was long and brutal, and many lives were lost. In the end, the tribe of Benjamin was nearly wiped out. The remaining members of the tribe were left devastated, and the Israelites mourned the loss of life that had resulted from their inability to stop the evil from spreading. The story of the Levite and his concubine is one of the darkest in the Bible. It shows the consequences of sin, selfishness, and injustice. The Levite's choices, made in fear and anger, led to pain, destruction, and death. It teaches us the importance of making the right choices, of acting with compassion and justice, and of respecting others. The Levite's failure to do what was right caused irreparable damage and suffering for many people. The lesson of this story is clear. When we turn away from what is right, the consequences can be far-reaching, and the price of our actions can be steep. The Levite and his concubine's tragic story serves as a reminder that our decisions matter, and they can shape not only our lives, but the lives of those around us.